tech industry for a couple decades now and have over the years accumulated a few interesting topics. And I picked three to run through with you today, and I'll call the set of them lessons for product leaders. The three topics we'll talk to are about forming a great team, running a great team, and taking control of your time. And we'll talk through each of them as we go. Maybe just two caveats before we start. One is the goal here is somewhat uniqueness over comprehensiveness. There's lots of great resources on how to be a great product leader, and I've just picked out three things that I find people find a little bit unique, and so we'll talk about that. And then second is, this talk is not really about Coda, but Coda was built to enable anyone to remake the world around them. So the talk is given in Coda, as you can tell, and Coda brings a lot of examples to life. But if you have questions about Coda specifically, we can talk about it afterwards. So with that in mind, let's get started. All right, so let's start with topic number one, and this is talking a little bit about how to think about a rubric for understanding great product managers and product leaders. And as we go through it, I'll actually explain a bit that I think this extends well beyond product leaders, but it was originally designed for product leaders. Maybe a little bit of history to kick this off. So I joined Google in 2008. In 2011, Larry Page took over as CEO, and amongst a number of changes he made, one thing he did was he switched us from a functional orientation to a business unit orientation. And so we got split into 8 divisions. I was responsible for the YouTube division, but there's 7 others. And in that process, one of the consequences was that there was no central functional teams anymore. Up till then, and we were already about 15,000 people, but up till then, the product management team, the engineering team, so on, all reported right into Eric Schmidt. And that all changed. And so in order to address, mostly that was a very good thing, allowed each of the teams to move a lot faster, but there were a handful of things that sort of fell through the cracks. And one of them was calibration. And Google ran a performance management process that's perhaps a little bit different than most companies, in that whether or not you were promoted was not determined by your manager, it was determined by a committee. And that process was called calibration. It would happen twice a year. We would take all the calibrators to a hotel here near the airport, put them all in different rooms, give them packets of information about each candidate looking for promotion, and then they would try to make a decision. So in this process, we didn't really have anybody to run this process, and so I was asked to run the first year of this process. So we get together to plan for how we're going to run these calibration committees. And one of the questions that got asked was, how do we feel about our rubric? So by rubric, I mean we had a guide that said, this is what a junior PM is, a senior PM is, a staff PM is, and a group PM, and so on. And we all sort of contemplated that we weren't that satisfied with the guide. And so I decided to run a little bit of a test. Uh-oh, my video got fuzzy. We'll fix that, I think. So I ran a little bit of a test, and I took the current rubric. Google had already been around for 14, 15 years at that point, and so we had this rubric that was fairly dated. And so we took that and I cut it into little strips of paper. So one strip per level, and I cut off what the name and number for each level, and I handed it out to the group of product leaders, and I asked people to identify what level was represented by that text. And as you might imagine, it was fairly random. Some of the things that had sort of crept in over the years, we had, one of them would read something like, this person can manage a medium-sized project, takes great notes in meetings, and interviews at least 3 people a week. And, each of these things had been constructed based on whatever incentives we were trying to create at the time. Nobody could identify, given the set of bullets, whether that represented a junior PM or a group PM. It was very hard to tell. Now, if you took all of the different levels and you took those strips of paper and you laid them out side by side, then you could order them. And the main way you could order them was there was an escalating set of adjectives. And so small project, medium project, large project, so on, those types of things. And so the first exercise we did was we tried to calibrate those orderings. Said, okay, if that's the main axis that differentiates these levels, let's talk about scope. And so we came to this definition here, this bottom axis, which is you could define scope as this person manages a feature, then a group of features, then a sub area of a product, then multiple sub areas of product, then a whole product, and then a line of multiple products. And so that seemed like a reasonable definition, and we talked about that for a while. But it turned out that was fairly dissatisfying too. And there were a few reasons why it was dissatisfying. Number one, it wasn't well calibrated across teams. So, for example, the search team at Google had one product, Google Search. And on the other hand, the ads team had like 50 different projects and 50 different products. And so all the PMs were gradually learning that if they worked on ads, it was easier to get promoted. So the search team didn't really like that. So it's problem number one. Problem number two was that each of the scope felt like an input, not an output. The way we looked at it is we just gave this person this job because we thought they were pretty good. Now, how can we promote them based on the fact that we gave them the job? That doesn't seem like that doesn't seem like the right way to think about it. And then the third issue with this process was that it devalued what some of our best PMs were doing, which was taking on very risky projects. So sometimes we would hand a PM a project that was small to begin with, but we expected it to grow. And this system undervalued that. And so it would sort of target people and push them to work on just the bigger products. So those are some of the issues with scope axis. So we discussed alternatives, and we decided to adopt an axis that we'd actually been using at YouTube for a while. The acronym for it is PSHE. It stands for Problem, Solution, How, Execution. I will say that over the years, I've tried hard to come up with a better word for this acronym, and I have not been able to come up with a better one. So I instead run with PSHE. And unfortunately, that's the best we have. But it turns out to be fairly sticky, PSHE. So here's how it works. Early on, a product manager will start their career. They're handed a problem. They're handed a solution. They're handed a how. This is here's what you're supposed to do. You need to go to this meeting. You need to write this document. You need to talk to this partner. You need to attend this forum. And the job is mainly to execute. Gradually, as the PM gets more senior, they're given a problem. They're given a solution. And then they have to come up with the how. How should I run the milestones? How should I set up the meetings? What should the cadence be? Which write-ups do we do? Which ones do we not do? Gradually, PM gets more senior. We hand them a problem, and they come back with a solution to the problem. And then finally, we hand PMs a space, and they come back with the problems and tell us what the problems are. So that's PSHE. This is the left axis here. The next exercise we did is each of us took our teams and we tried to slot them into if you can think about this as a matrix, you can slot people in each of the different cells. And what we found was that people naturally fit along this black line. And what that means is early on in people's careers, they mostly were growing on the scope axis. They were mostly executing and growing on this axis. Later in people's careers, similarly, you're running a division, you're running large products, so on. You're mostly growing on the size of those products. But in the middle, the graphs seem to turn vertical, and you'll see this orange circle that I like to call the trough of disillusionment. And the reason for that is, as I was explaining to this promotion committees, was, if you sit down for promotion committee and you say, let's say here is a level 3 and here is a level 7, whatever the numbers might be, most of the promotions were happening in this segment. And what I would tell the committee is, listen, this axis is very useful on two ends of your career, but for most of the candidates you will be talking to or talking about, this other axis is more relevant. Or another way to put this is the difference in the candidates is not the job they do, it's how they do the job. So that's a very interesting instruction for a committee. For the person, it's a very different perspective, because throughout most of our careers, honestly, throughout our schooling and so on as well, we get used to the idea that scope is a primary axis for development. And so the reason I call this the trough of disillusionment is it's often the moment where product leaders get stuck and they feel like they're not progressing because they've been used to using this axis as a rubric instead of this one. So this is a tool that I've used now for 15 years or so, and I found it very effective. One last thing to say about it is this was originally designed for product managers, as I described, but I found it to be useful for just about every role. I use the same basic rubrics for engineers, for designers, even for things like marketers and salespeople. Just to use an example, if you think about salespeople, and you ask a group who's the best salesperson, somebody might say, "Oh, here's the person who has the best quota attainment. This person is 200% of their quota every quarter." But every good salesperson knows that quota attainment is mostly just about good negotiation, and that if you just set your quota low, you can probably get good quota attainment. So if you ask the group honestly who's the best salesperson, they'll describe the person in terms like, well, here's a person that seems to be able to take on any challenge. And you can hand them a space with a new product, with a disagreeable customer, a new market, a product in decline. Like, these are people that seem to know how to take an unformed space, identify the problems, come up with the right solutions, and figure out how to execute on them. And so this same idea, PSHE, I think applies across most disciplines. So that's topic number one. Let's jump ahead to topic number two. Looking forward to your questions on each of the different topics. So here we will talk about cadence, and in particular this line here, design your rhythm like you design your app. So this is a really important concept. What I'll start with this example. So this is from a book called Game Storming. A very interesting book, and worth taking a look. This book is a playbook or compendium of games that people play in meetings. It's a very useful book, a good one to keep around. But they start with an example that I find very sticky. So they start with this example of these two kids playing ball, and the two kids are throwing the ball back and forth. And at one point, one of the kids says, "How about we keep score? And we just track how many times we can do this without dropping the ball." The other kid says, "Okay, great. How about I take a step back every time and we see how many times we can keep this going?" And I'm sure each of you have either played this game or seen kids playing this game. But one observation is, at some point in that process, I switched from calling it play to calling it games. The observation of the authors of this book is that meetings have the same dynamic. Sometimes we show up at meetings and they feel like play. We don't quite know what we're doing. We're here, there's no agenda. We're just kind of screwing around. And sometimes meetings feel like games. And games have some characteristics. Games have rules. They have objectives. They have boundaries. You can do this, you can't do this. They often have time limits. They often have materials. You can't play ball without a ball, and you can't do a post-it brainstorm without post-it notes. So using that model, if you start thinking about our processes, you think about our meetings and so on as a spectrum between play and game, you can now rethink how they work. And in particular, the way I think about it is, think about designing your meetings like you design your applications. If you were designing your applications, you would sit down and think about your incentives. This is what I want people to do. I want people to fill out this information. I want people to come back this often. I want people to use these buttons, but not these buttons. That type of design is something we're all used to doing in our products. And my main message from this section is, do the exact same thing for your meetings and for your cadence. So let me give in this section, which I think is in the chat, you can go and find. I've left a number of examples here of people who have transformed their forums and meetings into what I would think of as better games. And I'm gonna give you just one example, and I'll just do my own. So this first example here, Shishir's Guide to Distributed Teams. This is a document. You can go read the rest of the document. It's quite interesting, but it's mostly about how to run teams that are spread across geographies. Something I've now been doing for a couple decades, but it's obviously something very relevant in our current times. We can talk about that separately if we like, but I'm in particular going to focus on this second section here on meetings. And same statement: to design your meetings like you design your apps. And I'm going to just go down to two examples of what we do at Coda to illustrate how this works. So the first example I'll use is what's called a dory. So this is a name that was actually invented at Google. So at Google, there was a tool used for a meeting called TGIF. So every Friday, Larry and Sergey would get up in front of the whole company, and they would answer questions for the whole company, and tens of thousands of people. And so there was a tool where people could add their questions, and they could vote them up and down. And it was called Dory. It's named after the fish from Finding Nemo who asks all the questions. And the way it works is fairly simple. You come, add a new question, and you can go upvote and downvote each of the different questions here, and the list will resort itself accordingly. So that's the basic idea. At Google, we use this for very large meetings, tens of thousands of people. At Coda, we actually use this for meetings with even a very small number of people, sometimes as few as 3, 4, or 5 people. And originally this was done for distributed teams, but over time we've seen that this causes a few other incentives or things to happen. The first one is it equalizes the audience. Most meetings have a dynamic, I'm sure you've been in the meeting, where the questions are all asked by whoever is the loudest person or whoever is the most senior person. And this equalizes that forum. Anybody can ask a question. My own questions are ranked right alongside everybody else's questions. Second, you discuss what matters. You walk out of the meeting and you say, hey, we didn't handle everything, but we handled everything with at least 3 upvotes. Now you feel very satisfied. And finally, you get better form questions. If you ask people to write questions down, they will be much more thoughtful and generally stated in a more factual way. So, when we designed this, we used to do this mostly because we were a fairly distributed team. But it turns out that because we like the process so much, even when we're all in one room, we use the exact same process. So this is one example. The second one is something we call pulse or pulse check. And this one is also quite simple. The basic idea is you come into a meeting and you want to come to some agreement, and you say, hey, how does everybody feel about this decision? Should we launch this feature? Should we enter this market? Should we hire this person? Should we buy this company? And the way it works is you can check this box to show or hide everybody. You add your pulse check and you say, how are you feeling? And you say, I think we should definitely launch this. It is awesome. And then I click this box and I can see everybody's results. So why do we do this? Well, it certainly saves time. You don't go around the room and hear what everybody's saying in sort of a repeated way. But the main reason we do this is it avoids groupthink. And I'm sure you've all been in meetings like that where somebody says, how do we feel about this? And first person says, I think we should do it. And the second person says, yes, we should definitely do it. And by that point, the third person has a very hard time saying anything but yes. And so this allows for a tool to reduce groupthink in meetings. So these are 2 examples from Coda. I think the examples shared here, there's a number of good ones. Gokul is runs Caviar, now owned by DoorDash, used to be owned by Square, has one for making decisions called Spade. Claire Hughes Johnson's at Stripe COO, has one for running great offsites. This one is actually from Yuki Yamashita, who runs product at Figma, a popular design tool, and they do a really creative thing for how they ship product. Zapier runs a very distributed team. Jenny is a design lead at Square. This is all about how to run effective one-on-ones, which is another incentive-based meeting that may not be obvious how you can use that. These are all great examples, and feel free to look at them and use them. But I think the bigger message I would give is design your rhythm like you design your app. And so this is the second portion of what I wanted to share. All right, last topic. So now we'll get personal. And here I'll like to talk about taking control of your time. And thematically kind of similar to the last topic, but oriented not towards your teams, but towards yourself. And my main observation here is your ability to be successful as a product leader usually is upper bounded by however in control you are of your own time. If you are distracted, disheveled, so on, then the chances that you can run your team effectively is very low. And so this is a really important starting point of getting all the basics right first. So for this, I thought I would start with what was a very impactful tweet that I read, and this is from a guy named Des Traynor. For people who don't know Des, Des is the founder of a company called Intercom, a very popular and uh, widely used B2B CRM tool. Actually, the chat module in Coda, if you just hit the question mark, that's Intercom. And many companies and products around the internet will use Intercom. But this actually doesn't have much to do with Intercom. This is a tweet that he sent out over a year ago now. That's interesting. And it said, thinking about productivity and its tools, your email is what others think you should work on. Your to-do list is what you think you should work on. And your calendar is usually what you actually work on. How much do they overlap in your world? And he had all of these different Venn diagrams to show that overlap. Now, interesting observation about this. So first off, 1,400 people liked it, over 400 people retweeted it. So it's fairly popular, but by itself, not, something that's insightful, interesting, so on, but hard to implement. So what I want to show you is an example of how to take control of your time. And in this case, I'm just going to walk through how Des turned this into an implementation. And again, you can go click this link and you can copy it and try it if you like. And I'll come back to some of the messages. But think of this as an example of how to take control of your time. So in this example, same tweet here. He does 3 steps of pre-work. So if you copy the doc, it'll walk you through this. And basically, you set up those 3 things. So you set up your to-do list. He has a very simple one here. Feel free to pick a different one. Then you sync your email. So Coda has a thing called packs, which allow Coda to integrate with different systems like Gmail and Calendar and so on. In this case, the way he does it is he syncs his starred Gmail messages into this table. So you see all your Gmail threads. And then the last step is he syncs his calendar. And it's the same idea, it syncs from your calendar into Coda. So that's it. That's the pre-work. You get these 3 things set up. And then you run your system. And there's 4 steps every week to running this system. So the first step is, and you basically work in order. So you clear your inbox. So you take everything that you starred in your inbox and you either add it to your to-do list or you link it to something on your to-do list. Second, you rearrange your calendar to match. So you take all those things on your to-do list and you either, and you look at your calendar and you either match to something on your calendar or you add a new calendar event for it. Then throughout the week, you run your week, and now your to-do list now has 2 extra columns. It has a column for when you're going to tackle each of those items, and it has a column for where it came from. And then finally, at the end of the week, you get this reflection. And this reflection says, it's a chart that shows you what portion of your time was spent on things that had linked to-dos versus didn't. And it gives you this number of what portion of your time was spent on things that were on your list. What is the center of your Venn diagram? So a couple reasons I like this example. One, I personally find it incredibly useful. I think that I've been using the system for about a year now. And so I've been tracking this number on a week-by-week basis for almost a year now. And I'll say, like, this week I'm at 45%. Any week where I cross 50% is a really good week. It's very, very hard for me to get to 50%, which I think is somewhat surprising. And when I first saw that, I was a little bit shocked that how is it possible that only half of my time is spent on things that were on my to-do list at the beginning of the week. But that's turned out to be actually a quite hard rubric for me to hit. The second reason I like this example is if you just step back and think about how this started. It started with this tweet. And I'm sure many of you have seen things like this on Twitter or on blogs or so on. You've read it, you've liked it, maybe you filed it away, and then you've forgotten about it. In this case, looks like 1,400 people did that. This document represents, if you sort of abstract it back, I think of this as a tweet that has been compiled into software. And in this way, he's taken this insight, which is a very interesting, fun insight, and he's turned it into an implementation, and he's taken control of his time. Now, on the specific example, I'll say, for some people, that example really resonates, and that sounds like amazing. For me, it did. For others, that sounds really scary. And so I don't mean to imply you need to run Des's system. But the most important thing is just think about the key characteristics of your system and then design your cadence around it. So these were the 3 topics I had in mind. And if I had to give just a couple things to end with, You know, as you think about forming a great team or about your own progress as a product leader, think about these four letters, PSHE. How far up the spectrum is the person operating, or how are you operating, from execution to how to solution to problem? As you design your cadence, as you think about how your team operates, think about designing your rhythms like you design your apps. Apply the same level of rigor to thinking about the incentives and judging the production of how your meetings operate. And then finally, look at yourself and try to make sure that you're taking control of your own time, because that will upper bound how much impact you can have with your teams. So that's those were the three topics I wanted to share, and I think we can switch over to questions now.
Yeah, thanks, Shishir. This is great. I think I made a lot of notes myself. And moving to the questions, overall we got probably 300 plus questions from the audience,
Oh
and
boy.
we had to sort of cut it down to a few ones. Uh, for those who don't know, Coda recently raised another round of funding, another series. Uh, and a huge congratulations to you, Shishir, and the whole Coda team for this feat. And what do you want to hear from you today is how do you think collaboration software are will look like in the coming decade? And this is a twofold question. And how do you any key insights on how Coda will move forward from this point after this recent feat?
Well, thanks. Yes, we just raised our Series C of funding. It's about $80 million from led by Mamoon Hamid at Kleiner Perkins, and I'm pretty excited about the round. Obviously, it's good to be able to invest even faster in a fast growing business, so that's good. Mamoon, I think, for people who don't know him, I consider him to be one of the best B2B SaaS investors I know, and so I was very excited to get him involved in the company, and of course, raising money in the middle of a pandemic is always a little bit of a challenge, and so I was happy to be able to execute on that. So maybe I'll split your question and talk a little bit about how I think about productivity and collaboration tools first, and then we can talk a little bit about where we're headed next. You know, I think we're in the middle of one of the most interesting productivity reinvention periods that we've seen in a long time. And if you think about where Coda came from, there were a couple main observations that lead to Coda. The first one is that I think the world runs on docs, not apps. And what I mean by that is, if you look at how your teams operate, or how your businesses operate, or how your colleagues operate, and you ask them for what tools they use, they'll name all sorts of applications. And you know, I use this for tasks. We use this for CRM. We use this for inventory, so on. You watch them all day long, and they'll be in documents, spreadsheets, presentations, and communication tools. That is the basis of how everything actually operates. And that I find very interesting. But that this line, we generally don't put those two things side by side. But oftentimes, the thing you're replacing when you're deploying your CRM system is a big spreadsheet. And this is something I've seen throughout my career. But the world has artificially separated these two dynamics, two product categories. The second observation that leads to Coda is that I think that those tools haven't changed fundamentally in over 50 years. And we have this running joke at the company that if Austin Powers were to pop out of his freezing chamber, he wouldn't know what clothes to wear or what music to listen to, but he would know how to work a document, a spreadsheet, and a presentation, because they haven't really changed since the 1970s. And if you go back and look at WordStar, had Harvard Graphics and VisiCalc, and for students of history in the space, those were the first three document, spreadsheet, and presentation tools. They've basically been copied through multiple generations of operating systems. And we've taken them and moved them from green screens to DOS to Windows to Mac OS to the web browser to the phone. But we're really looking at the same constructs that happened in the 1970s. And if you think about it, in that same period, every other part of software has fundamentally changed. And operating systems are unrecognizable from the 1970s, or things even fundamental like databases have gone through so many rounds of iteration. Things like search engines and social networks didn't even exist back then. And yet the thing that we look at all day long, that we do our work in, that we run our teams in, that we run our businesses in, that we run our families in, that set of tools hasn't changed in 40, 50 years. That seems crazy to me. And so I think that if we look at what's happening in the productivity and collaboration space now, I think we're in the middle of basically a renaissance. I mean, I don't know what it felt like in Paris in the Renaissance period, but it feels very similar. You know, the number of new tools coming, the number of new approaches, the number of creative entrepreneurs approaching this problem, I think it's just amazing. It's and really exciting, Coda included. And I think we're going to see a lot of it. And I think we're going to see it steer us in a number of different directions. But probably the main thing I expect to see is a lot of change. So maybe that's a little bit on just to start on where I think why we're seeing so much innovation here. You know, in terms of where we're headed, you know, I think we're fairly early still, and the Coda 1.0 was released in February of last year, so we've been in market for a little less than 18 months now. The product has grown very quickly. We're used by about 25,000 teams around the world now, and it's a product that's sort of built to spread. So not surprising, because it's, you know, the documents and applications are better when you use them with other people, and so that naturally happens. And I think we have a long list of things we want to go work on to continue with that ambition and motivation.
Interesting. Interesting.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Shishir. I think that was interesting. And I'll second part on that deck. That was really exciting as well. One question, I think our community members, we got a bunch of questions around, hey, you know, we use Coda, and I think a bunch of them are quite passionate about it. One thing we noticed is the beauty of Coda is in its edge cases or in the use cases. You know, sometimes you might think that it is for a particular case, but what are some of the most out of box or unexpected use cases that you've seen people use Coda for, or what something that might have surprised you so far?
Yeah, and I think I'll sometimes divide product leaders into two buckets, and what I think of as platform thinkers and product thinkers. And interestingly for me, I've had the opportunity to work on a number of platforms in YouTube and SQL Server and Windows and so on, and the difference, I think, the classic product thinkers, you know, Steve Jobs is probably the best example. For them, they need to control every part of the experience, and you know, he ships the iPhone without a store and the Mac without normal screw holes and so on. The platform thinkers, you like being surprised, and you expect to be surprised, and so I really like this question because you know, it's a very commonplace at YouTube. I'd walk into work and, you know, every day somebody did something that would surprise you. Sometimes in a really positive way, it's like, I can't believe they got that done, and sometimes in a negative way, and you deal with those things too. So you know, so Coda, I mean, sort of countless examples of how people have reconstructed their lives, their teams, their communities, so on around an insight. You know, sort of like Des did with that tweet, is people will take an insight and they'll sort of bring it to life.
Right.
You know, maybe one good example is something that this shipped a few weeks ago. It's called Schoolhouse.world, and it came from Sal Khan. Sal Khan runs Khan Academy.
Yep.
And this is it's pretty interesting example. If you go to Schoolhouse.world, it's a Coda doc, and it has basically two sides: students and tutors. And you know, maybe backing up for a moment, Sal started Khan Academy, and then he also wrote a book called One World Schoolhouse. And he even bought the domain at that time, schoolhouse.world. And he has this vision that what we think of as the schoolhouse doesn't need to be a physical building in our neighborhood, that anybody can teach from anywhere. And the types of people that can teach and the types of people that can learn come from anywhere. And so when the pandemic started, it happened to be about the same time we launched publishing. This is a feature of Coda where you can publish a doc like a website. He asked me, could I do this in Coda? And we very quickly built it. It only took a couple hours to build the first version of this, and he got it up and running. And it's a matchmaking document. And so students say, this is what I'm interested in learning. Tutors say, this is what I'm interested in teaching. And they get match made and turn into group tutoring sessions. It gets run through this, we have these packs for integrating with different systems. So it uses the Zoom pack to be able to schedule these video conferences, kind of like what we're doing now. I really like this example for a bunch of different reasons. I think as a impactful, interesting idea, it's just sort of a little bit out there of different use cases, and we see Coda used a lot within teams. But this is a very interesting sort of global scale project, and they have thousands of students using this already. I also personally really like this example because Sal's contribution to YouTube is, he was my inspiration actually for a lot of the things we did on YouTube, and he was one of those very surprising cases of the idea that the as far as I can tell, the most prolific educator on the planet is a single person named Sal Khan, who has no background in teaching and no background in media. And anybody who knows Sal knows it's just so obvious to him to work that way. And it's just fun to watch him do a similar thing on a new platform, and again find a new way to apply it. But that I think is one that I've been really excited about.
Yeah, that's a great example, I think. And Parth, I think that we should explore that as well, because that use case fits so well.
Mhm.
Yeah. So moving on to probably stories before Coda and two of the biggest companies that you were part of. So Shishir, what were the key differences in product management and product leadership at Microsoft and Google that you felt? And how exactly did you? So you mentioned about the PSHE framework that you implemented at Code as well. So how did you go about, picking the best of the two and bringing that culture to Coda?
Yeah. I've had the pleasure of working at a few of the most interesting leading companies in the tech industry, and I think I feel very lucky to have done that. And I'd say first off, probably more similarities and differences between Microsoft and Google, and both companies full of amazing people, real priority on hiring amazing people. Both companies structured around and encouraging people to think very big and be very ambitious in their ideas. Think, every idea, what could be, take it to the next level. Both companies very driven by product and technical innovation at the heart of the company. And so lots of similarities in the companies. I think obviously created in different eras, and so their core strengths were a little bit different. Microsoft created in the era of packaged software, and so you get a very different type of product hygiene, execution cadence, so on. When you ship products every 3 years, you get a very different type of operating model. And Google was the opposite. Google was born in the internet generation, and so you got a very fast cycle time type of product, and that leads to slightly different dynamics. It incents people who can not only project and plan, but people who can react and iterate. It encourages thinking in ecosystems, because ecosystems, these things tend to have compounding effects very quickly. And so, many of the great leaders at Google could understand those dynamics. That if we do this, this is how the world reacts, because it all happens very quickly. So I'd say, more similarities than differences, and most of the differences I'd say were the nature of different eras of development. I think we tried to bring all of the best parts of that to Coda, and I think certainly that sense of thinking big, starting with the product, starting with the user, stretching technology into things that maybe people didn't think were possible, are all certainly parts of how we operate. There's obviously a big difference operating at a scale of thousands of people, tens of thousands of people, and Coda right now is 70 people. And so your processes work differently, and you want to take advantage of that. And you want to take advantage of that ability for everybody to contribute. And I'd say probably the biggest difference in a startup environment is forming that sense of collective mission and team. I think we operate very fast. Anyone in the call who's a Coda user probably knows. I think we ship faster than any tool I've seen. And I often get asked about how we do that. How did we structure it so that we can do that? And the simplest answer I say is you just treat everybody in the company like an owner. And if you treat people like owners, you don't need the rest of the incentives. And that there's lots of different ways you do that. You do that by giving large equity grants and making sure that they actually economically feel like owners. But it's also how you treat them in how the company operates. So we run an incredibly transparent company. I mean, at many levels. Our board meetings are open to the whole company. Our main decision-making forum, something we call Coda Catalyst, happens on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Anybody can join and participate, and you get this collective sense of this is our product, not your product, and then you get a different level of innovation. So lots of similarities, and I think that's one thing that is a difference. I think, again, mostly based on size. I think there was a time when Google and Microsoft felt like that too, but I think these days that's something that is easier to see in a startup.
Right. Absolutely. Shishir, one thing that can't go unnoticed is the background, your Zoom background. So, adding to that, I think 2 points that you mentioned in this call. One was around your launched the first version in 2019, and another one was around this culture bit that Path has. So, when early stage product managers on this, a lot of product managers here work with 0 to 1 startups, or 1 to 10 startups early on, not MNC. Um, you've been building Coda for quite some time, but you launched much later, whereas a lot of others are from that school of thought that fail, launch fast, fail fast, iterate, learn from your customers. And so how do you look at both of these, and how do you suggest a lot of them to think about this?
Yeah, I mean, I've a couple thoughts
Yeah,
on this. So we started the company in 2014, and we launched in 2019, so 4.5 years or
exactly.
so after the and I think, just to be clear, in that period, we were iterating very fast with customers. So it wasn't. I didn't feel like we were ready for the public, but I absolutely felt like it was very important to be constantly getting the product in different customers' hands and learning from it. I think there's in fact, maybe one fun story. The first customers we gave the product to was only 6 months after we started the company. So we got the product up and running. We were using it ourselves. We handed it to this company. The company, we were about 6 people. This company was also about 6 people. And I said, hey, it seems to be working well for us. Will you try it? And they were using the product. We had a dashboard for our metrics, which only went from 0 to 6, because that's how many people they had.
Yeah,
so,
yeah,
so every day we'd look at it and, oh, look, it was a 5, it was a 6, it was a 5, it was a 6. One day it drops to 0. And, we're like, oh, wonder what happened. And then the next day it stays at 0. And so I call up the CEO of this company and I say, what happened? Are you guys like on vacation? You take an offsite? And he gave me a very memorable response. Is, oh, yes, I meant to call and tell you, I wasn't quite sure how to say this, but I had a team meeting and the team decided that if I make them keep using Coda, actually at the time it was called Krypton, if I make them keep using Coda, they're all going to quit. And and I said, boy, that's kind of extreme.
right.
And he said, no, it's okay. There's good news. And I said, okay, I don't know how you follow that up with good news, but okay.
Yeah,
And he said, no, the team has collected a list of feedback, and they're all very aligned with your vision, but they have a list of things that they really need you to finish, because otherwise they can't get their work done. And I have the list, and it's got 30 things on it. And if you just do this list, we'll be happy to try again. And so this was our first few rounds felt like that. And one of there's a couple things I would say about this general ship fast, fail fast culture. And I think my primary investor is a guy named Reid Hoffman, who's very famous for if you're not
right.
embarrassed by the thing you shipped, then you probably shipped too late. And so I've had him come and talk to the team many times about this statement. And actually, meta level, I would say, be careful with truisms, any of them, even from me. Every one of them requires interpretation. If it applies to you, then it was clear to me that the state the product was in at that point, we could have shipped it, and all we would have done is had a lot of people tell us what this first CEO told me, and we were just not ready. And it was
Right.
very clear. I think there's a couple things that are important in this process for Coda, and these are both principles of ours. One we call right versus familiar. Another one is that great ideas take time to grow. And I think both of them are interesting to think about. So when you're designing a product like Coda, a lot of cases you end up with a choice that we now call right versus familiar. And we'll be looking at a problem and we'll say, here's how every other product before us has done it. Should we just do it the same way? And as I was telling you earlier, Austin Powers still would recognize document spreadsheets and presentations. So this has been happening in our space for a long time, that we just do whatever the last people did. And so when you look at those things, you have to decide, am I going to do it different or am I going to do it the same? And it's not always clear which way you do it, But culturally at Coda, this is a thing we do a lot. We'll look at problems and we will step back and say, why was it done that way? Why? It's not enough to say it was done that way before. You have to rethink it a little bit and get back to first principles. And sometimes the right answer is to be familiar, and sometimes the right answer is to do something a little bit different and come at it a different way. So this is a core philosophy of ours. That takes time, and I think if you're going to take an approach where you're going to try to do things a little bit differently, you have to be willing to try them out, let them succeed and fail, and experiment within that. The second one is great ideas take time to grow. And I think this is something that cultures that figure out how to do this well, I think last a long time. And I think it's something that Coda is very good at. And there's a lot of examples of this at Coda, but one of my favorites is that the way our hackathons work. So we do hackathons 4 times a year, which by the way, and they're super impactful. I'd say 80% of the best ideas in Coda came out of a hackathon, which is, by the way, really surprising to me because I could never get hackathons to work at YouTube or Microsoft. They never really produced real results. I mean, they were good team building events, but they never produced. At Coda, it's the opposite. They produce real results. And the reason, I think the core reason why, is we don't insist on shipping the things that come out of hackathons. And so we actually just did one last week. The 10 projects got done. Amazing projects, lots of amazing things. We take those things, we do great write-ups, we take a bunch of screenshots and images and so on. We put them on the shelf and we come back to them later. And that takes enormous discipline. And this was, I think, our 12th hackathon that we ran last week. And so we've gotten used to it now. And so everybody understands how this works. But that discipline is really hard because what it allows you to do is give your idea time to grow. And like I showed, for example, PAX, this ability to connect Coda to different systems. Yeah. The hackathon that came out of it was called Action Links. It was unrecognizable from how the feature launched. And if we had launched it then, it would have been the wrong timing. We didn't have the right building blocks to surround it with. We didn't have the state the product was in wasn't ready for it. The state the market was in wasn't ready for it. And so we waited until it was the right moment and then let it refine itself. And so I think that principle is really important. So anyway, backing up a minute, I'd say the principle of ship fast, fail fast, I think what that means is get feedback. Go make sure you hear what people say. Even if what they're going to say to you is, hey, all my employees are going to quit if I have to keep using your software. Be ready to hear that. And I think that's really important. But if you take that in isolation, failure isn't the goal, right? We're not, and nobody's at this trying to fail. I don't know why my camera keeps getting fuzzy like that. I'll fix that. The goal is to build something often a little bit different. Those things require questioning, and sometimes they require time. And I think this idea, great ideas take time to grow, is a really important one as well.
Right, absolutely. Thanks so much for sharing that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, Shishir, because of today's topic, was on for product leaders, we have a lot of PM managers and leaders have joined us today. And a key question that has come across is how exactly do you go about coaching other PMs? And so even the frameworks that you described today, how do you impart them to your teams that you have built across Microsoft, Google, and now Coda?
Yeah, I mean, I think that here's another observation, right? So if you're a sports player, if you play basketball, you play cricket, so on, you go to matches, but you also go to practice. And one of the interesting observations of product leaders is we have no practice. I think you'd be a pretty crappy cricketer or basketball player or so on if you all you ever did was real game time. And so I think the idea of being a great PM and so on, I think it requires practice. And so that's a big piece that you have to build into your culture as well, is how do you create safe places to try, safe places to learn, safe places to get feedback from people who can understand and guide on what you're working on. I was going to give one example of this. Here, I'll share my screen again quickly. There's another. This is another document. I guess I'll put this in the chat as well. This is one called Eigen Questions, and this is a technique we use for framing problems. It comes out of a story from YouTube. I'll tell the story very quickly. This is and I'll come back to this term eigenquestion. But this is, I think, a really good example of how learning some of these techniques. So the story was in 2008, we had this big question of what should we do at YouTube? What should we do with queries that we don't have good answers to? And the example that was generally given was Modern Family. So it was a very popular TV show at the time. If you type Modern Family into YouTube, our results were quite poor. We didn't have Modern Family on the platform. And so there was this big debate. Should we, Google had just bought the company. Should we do what Google would do? And what would Google do? They would just link out to wherever the best result was, even if it wasn't on YouTube. And the product engineering team was very aligned on this view of the world. On the flip side, the business development and content partnerships team thought this was a stupid idea. If you link out to all these other properties, then nobody is ever going to put content on YouTube. And so this debate was framed for a while. And if you just think of this, I use this as an example a lot. This debate was framed for a while as almost a good versus evil debate. Should we link out and do the right thing by the user, or should we not and do the right thing by the business? And we had this offsite to discuss what we should do. And at that offsite, I ended up presenting an alternative frame for it that we called consistency versus comprehensiveness. And the basic idea is, if you think about this query, we use this analogy of think about Amazon and Google Shopping. So at the time, Google Shopping was getting its butt kicked by Amazon. And nobody quite understood why, because Google Shopping should clearly be beating Amazon for a very simple reason. Google Shopping had indexed all of Amazon. So why would you ever go to Amazon if you could come to Google Shopping and search for all the products, including the ones on Amazon and the ones on the rest of the internet? That just seemed to make sense to us. And what we had gradually figured out was that the reason why people were going to Amazon was they preferred the consistent experience. They preferred knowing how the reviews worked, how the shipping model worked, how the returns worked, and so on. And so what we had decided is the shopping market, consistency was beating comprehensiveness. So we go to this offsite, and rather than saying, should we do the right thing by the user or the right thing by the business, we now reframed the problem and said, should we be consistent or should we be comprehensive? And we decided to be consistent. We decided that would be one of our values. In fact, it got written into one of our 10 values. And in making that decision, we also made 10 other decisions. We removed embed players from the site. Probably one of the most famous things we did is when the iPhone came out, there was no app store, there was no development toolkit. So they built the version of YouTube that ran on the iPhone. We're now years after that, and Apple was still building the version of YouTube that ran on the iPhone, and they weren't keeping up. They couldn't keep up with our feature set because we moved fast. And so only about half of the catalog played back on the iPhone. It was a terrible user experience. You couldn't actually watch YouTube on the iPhone. And so I drove down to Cupertino and told Apple, we're not gonna have you build the iPhone app for YouTube anymore. And we're going to give up default distribution, which, by the time, most popular operating system or most popular phone system out there. And, their natural question was, how could you possibly give out distribution in search of consistency? I said, well, that's our principle, consistency over comprehensiveness. And so it's very important, right? So this idea is what we call eigenquestions. And the term for, there's a mathematical basis for the term. The math doesn't matter that much, but it's basically a term from linear algebra. It's called eigenvectors. It says in a multidimensional space, the eigenvector is the vector that most accurately describes the dominant vector of the space. And this gets used a lot in machine learning and principal component analysis and PSHE and so on, that if you have all these different dimensions, you select out the main one. Put the math aside, it's a made-up word. And what it really means is the eigenquestion is a question where, if answered, it likely answers the subsequent questions as well. And it's a very simple way to think about it. Now, to answer your question about how, okay, so that's the idea, right? So this is one technique. And if you think about PSHE as a framing, this is like a really important part of the P and the S stage. It's like, can you ask the right question? Before, whether or not you can get to the right answer, can you ask the right question? So we do an exercise. And actually, when I wrote this document, we unfortunately gave up one of our main exercises to the world. But we do this with candidates, with interviewing candidates. And here's the exercise. And I find this interesting. This used to be my go-to interview question. A group of scientists has invented a teleportation device. They have come to you and asked for assistance in bringing it to market. What do you do? And that's it. That's the whole question, right? And so usually what people do is they start throwing out questions. Say, how big is the device? And, does it, how safe is it? And how much does it cost? And where can you place it? And can it work with people? And, do you need a receiver at both sides? And how fast is it? And they ask all these different questions. And at some point, I'll listen to all the questions and I'll say, it turns out these scientists are introverts. They're not at all enjoying all your questions. They've decided that they will only answer 2 questions. And from that, they expect you to give a clear go-to-market plan. What 2 questions would you like to ask? This exercise turns out to be a fantastic way to describe eigen questions because it's practice, not game, right? This is, nobody's inventing this product, at least as far as I know. So this is not real. And so we can honestly ask this question. This is, by the way, just to give a punchline, this is one of my favorite answers to this question. Is one of the candidates said, one question I'd ask is the device more costly to purchase or to operate? And how safe is the device? Is it safe enough for humans or not safe enough for humans? And if it is safe enough for humans and more costly to operate than to purchase, then we should run it like human fax machines. We should give them out to everybody. They're cheap. We should give them to everybody. And then when they want to use them, they'll use them. But if they're expensive to operate, or they're expensive to create, but not expensive to operate, then we should run them like airports. We can only set up a few of them, but we should set them up in very strategic location and use them like airplanes. So you can kind of like get a sense for, with just these 2 questions, you can get a pretty good sense of where this heads. So this is long answer to your question, but I think that the sort of main idea here is, if you want people to learn a technique, give them an ability to practice it, design what that practice looks like. And this is just sort of one example of what that practicing feels like as for eigen questions.
Very interesting. Yep. Shishir, I think we have a bunch of more questions, but we're just running out of time. So I'll pick up a couple of questions from the Q&A. I think we have about 13 plus questions. I'll try picking up 1 or 2 from the audience Q&A, and then we'll do our closing set.
Sure.
So couple of interesting ones, but I think clubbing a few around hiring. What are your thoughts on, how do PMs who are looking, like maybe from an example at Coda itself, you shared this nice example toward the end, and I think the vector that someone drew, that's really insightful for someone to put together that if that was during an interview. So what is like a make or break when you hire, for folks who are maybe midway through their careers? How do you suggest them to, look at a PM, a product carrier?
Maybe I'll separate those questions a little bit. So I think in terms of what we look for, PSHE sort of drives how we think about it. And so our questions are organized around that. And we'll look a lot at this. This is a real question that we used to ask in interviews. We don't anymore because I've given it up. But it's a good example of, we try to ask questions that I call neutral ground questions, meaning that they are not in our area of expertise nor in the candidate's area of expertise, so it can be on even ground as we talk through it, and look for their ability to structure spaces, to solve problems in lots of different dimensions. And we have a set that are design centered, that are strategy centered, that are technology centered, and so on. So you can get a sense for candidates in those different ways. We also do a thing in our process, which is maybe different than many companies, which is we ask the candidate to do a presentation. There's one tip I would give in terms of, and maybe this is switching to the other side of the question of how do you, so what do we look for? We look for PSHE. What do I recommend candidates do to stand out? I like to say every candidate is one great paper or blog post away from their dream job. And I think showing up with insight instead of showing up with skills is often a great way to shine. And I think this has worked very effectively for me as well. Each of my job transitions has sort of come out of a discussion about an idea and then a discussion about a job. And I think that's really important. We do a thing in our process where we ask the candidate to present to everybody on the interview loop, something that designers have done for years. So they do portfolio reviews, but for some reason people don't do it for other functions. And for product, it's a very impactful one. And the basic format is we'll ask someone to present their background, and just that also helps that everybody doesn't have to re-ask what your background is. and then present anything that you've done that you're proud of. And I think of it, sometimes I call it the brag session, is what, you get to, a lot of interviewing is about trying to figure out what should I ask to try to help this person show me their best self and show me their worst self. And that's a lot of what interviewing is about. So I look at the candidate presentation as a chance to say, it's up to you. Present whatever you like, an idea, a thought, a plan, whatever you like. And then sometimes we do an exercise along with that as well. But I find that one of my recommendations would be, if you're interviewing somewhere, ask to do that. Ask to do a presentation. And I find that many people walk in interviews and they just respond, and they just, okay, you ask whatever questions you want, and I'm just gonna respond to whatever your questions are. But in my back pocket, I have the secret of what makes me the right candidate for your company. Just ask them for the opportunity to tell them that, and to as broad a group as possible. And tell them, and it might be something from your background that you think is relevant. It might be something that you've done in your hobbies. It might be something that you've learned that you'd like to teach them. It might be something about their business that you feel like you can share. That hey, I think you could be doing this part better. Be wary of doing that, but it's you have to be even more right if you do that. But I think that taking control of that process is really important, and I think very few candidates do this. Is that let me take control of what I'd like you to know about me.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think that's a great point, and I think this will help a lot of folks here. Maybe dig deeper and definitely, yeah, I mean, get started on that. So thanks for that, Shishir. Shishir, maybe one more time for one more question from the audience, and then we jump into the closing set. One interesting thing, I think, the post that you wrote around bundling that went far and wide. I think within our community as well, a lot of people sharing it. I think there's a follow up on that. Ashwin asked, you mentioned how AdSense and ad networks that led to creation of millions of previously unviable businesses, and you also think that bundling offers a similar opportunity. Any examples of top three models that you see are evolving today? I think that would probably when YouTube, I think you had a famous thing around YouTube as well in 2008 where you said it would replace the cable, or it will take over cable. So any such things that you see in 2020?
Yeah. So maybe to answer the bundling question, and for people who haven't read, I just posted it in the chat as well.
Sure.
The paper, bundling is a very fun and interesting topic, I think, and something I spent a lot of time on. The paper is called Four Myths of Bundling because it's written from the perspective of a conversation with what I call a myth maker. The myth maker in that case is actually just myself from a couple of years earlier. These are all things I used to say with conviction. And it took me a while to discover that many of the things that we're talking about. Oh, I'm posting to the wrong part of the chat, huh? Thank you for helping with that. The you know the so this paper, which I'd encourage people to read and send feedback. 4 Myths of Bundling is all about a different way to think about product bundles. And one of the observations of the paper that Ashwin pointed out is that business model changes often create opportunity. And there's a analogy given in the paper. The paper is structured around what's called super fans, casual fans, and non-fans. And so, super fans are people who would pay retail for a product, have the activation energy to find it. Casual fans lack one of those two characteristics, and non-fans ascribe often zero or negative value to the product. The idea is that when most products are superfan products, you pay for what you get. The non-fan products tend to be things where you use them, but you don't necessarily ascribe that kind of value to them. And many of those are things that are monetized with advertising, where you can spend lots and lots of time on them. You never open up your checkbook, but you are, unbeknownst to yourself, producing revenue for a publisher. When AdSense came out, this is Google's model for allowing or selling ads across publishers. All of a sudden, many new businesses came up, and we had these businesses that are things like blogs and games, even social networks. I think would not have been viable without AdSense. YouTube would not have been viable without AdSense. And so it created all these businesses. And so one of the things I find interesting about the bundling and what I call the casual fan business models is that business model is not yet clear. And so I think there are similarly millions of businesses that haven't yet been created that will be created once that business model is clear. And so I think that's one really interesting thing that is happening. To maybe answer the broader question of other such trends that I see, you mentioned one that maybe I'll just follow up on. You know, what I call the maker generation, and the way I would think about this is, you know, when I got to YouTube in 2008, I gave a speech later that
Yeah,
year where, you know, for the first time, I had to speak publicly about YouTube, and I used this line that you said that YouTube or that online video would do to cable what cable did to broadcast, and we'd go from
exactly.
2 channels to 300 channels to 3 million channels. One interesting thing about that line at the time, I was basically laughed out of the room. Right? It seemed almost ridiculous to people because at the time, the main comparisons for YouTube were Flickr and MySpace. That's what people saw us as being comparable to. So the idea, I had people come up to me afterwards and say, "I don't understand. How do you think that your cat videos can compete with ESPN and Disney? Doesn't make any sense." And obviously, the thing that those people missed is, and this statement now, online video will do to cable what cable did to broadcast. A decade later, this statement is very clearly true. So what did those people miss? I think the number one thing they missed is they missed human ingenuity. They thought that you can't produce great content unless you live in Los Angeles and you go to USC Film School. That's the only way to create this kind of content. Um, the in this human ingenuity, I like to call this the maker generation. I think this maker generation is happening across industries. YouTube did this in video. You know, I think that if you look at things like Spotify or things like Etsy has allowed anybody who can make a craft to turn it into a business. Even things like, you know, games. Like I think these days games like Fortnite and Minecraft,
Yeah,
you don't just participate, you create. Like you build the world
exactly.
around you. So makers are part of all these different products. My view of it is that what we're doing with Coda, I'll get asked a lot, how did I go from YouTube to Coda? They seem so different, media to
Yeah,
productivity. In my mind, they are completely a continuation of the same mission, because in my mind, what we're going to do with Coda is we will do to software what YouTube did to video. And it's all based on the same theory, is that makers are capable of more than you think. This is the maker generation. And I think that idea of embracing makers, I think it may be impactful for your audience in terms of how to think about Coda, but also impactful for how do you think about every product. Because I think this idea that I'm going to hand you a product and expect you to not tweak it and turn it and mold it and shape it into your whatever it is, your life, your workplace, your family, whatever it is, you know, I think that's old. That's an old way of thinking. And in today's world, you should expect your products to be heavily customized, heavily integrated, heavily modified and adapted, and then people's sense of ownership of them is much higher, and your sense of spread will also be much higher. So that's a, you know, I think another topic that I find interesting, the maker generation.
very interesting, very interesting. I think with the no code movement and with a lot more things coming up, it will be interesting to see how this shapes out.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, Shishir, we'll move to the usual set that we ask everyone who joins us on these webinars. So, it's a 3x3 rapid fire. We're going to ask you three questions. Uh, and you can so first one, three early stage startups that you're really excited about. So, barring Coda, that all of us are excited about, but three early stage startups that you're following.
How early is early?
Early,
Could
mid,
you?
anything,
Pre-seed.
anywhere.
um, Okay, I'll pick a few. I think I'm a big fan of Superhuman. It's an email product that hopefully some of you use. I think very thoughtfully developed and in a category where people thought innovation was done. And I love how Rahul's going after it. The other reason I love Superhuman is his process for product development is very interesting. He wrote a really good post about the machine for finding product market fit. And I would heavily encourage people to read that. So that's one I find really interesting. Figma is one that I think is really interesting. I think Dylan's approach to building that product is also uh, interesting, and I find him and I have a very similar maker-centered view of the world, that people are capable of more than you might think, and I think they're building a very expansive product. And maybe the third one I'll pick might not meet most people's definition of early stage, but it depends, is TikTok. And I just find TikTok, I don't think that new forms of media get created that often. Um, and I think that I watch it in my own household. My younger daughter cannot walk into a room without doing a TikTok dance.
Oh,
Um,
wow.
and it's also, so that, and when I see that, it's sort of reshapes how you think about things. If you go hunting, you'll find some good videos of our family doing stuff on TikTok as well. But I just think new forms of media are uncommon, and when they happen, they're special. They should be treasured. I also find it really interesting because what. How interesting do you need to be for countries to be so upset at you? So I think that's makes for fun conversation as well. So three startups, stretching the definition of startup a little bit.
Interesting. So, yeah. So next, in the rapid fire set is three books that you would recommend to our community. I think one you did, but any other
Yeah, the
two,
two.
or if any other three.
um, okay, so Gamestorming is a good one. I think I'll pick I will pick a couple others. The one is Switch. So this is uh, for people who aren't familiar with it. I would recommend actually all the Heath Brothers books. The Heath Brothers are they're a couple professors. They've written a bunch of books, Made to Stick, Decisive, Switch, and Moments. If I had five books to recommend,
Those
Switch
would
would
be.
take two of the five slots for sure, and probably all of them would be on the list. Switch, I
Nice.
think, is one of the most impactful ways to think about it. The subtitle of the book is How to Change When Change is Hard. And it's just so impactful in all parts of life. And I have one recommendation for when you read this book, which is make a list of things you're trying to change, things that are maybe in your personal life, in your work life, in your industry, in your product. Make that list, and you will be able to catalog as you go through the book. They have 9 techniques as you go through the book. Catalog how often you use each technique and expose your own bias. What is your typical way to cause change? And they have this really interesting analogy, the rider on the elephant on a path. And think about, and how many cases are you motivating the elephant, directing the rider, or shaping the path? Very impactful book. And let's see, one more. A book that I found really impactful was *Sapiens*, and I think *Sapiens*. We I read the book. We read it as a family when we went on safari last summer, and I think it was very interesting reading the book. The early part of the book talks about a long period of history where humans were in the middle of the food chain, and not at the top. I think it's one of the observations of the book is that humans made it to the top of the food chain in about 70,000 years. That's significantly faster than any other species has done it. Lions and sharks and so on took, tens of millions of years to get to that point. Humans did it incredibly fast. And it talks through all the reasons why that is and what is intrinsic about humans that allows them to get there. It's a very interesting thesis on something he calls gossip. So for anybody who hasn't read this book, it's sort of a game changer in how you think about humanity, and you'll start to recognize a lot of patterns for how to think about the world around you. So maybe those are a few that I would think of.
Nice, nice. So last in the set, three folks that you would like to give a shout out to that the community should also follow.
So uh, okay, so I picked three that are um, uh, maybe fairly popular, but we'll see. One is Ben Thompson. He writes Trajectory. Um, Ben, interestingly, his background, he was a Microsoft product manager, much like me. And he just happens to be a prolific writer. He's also one of the clearest thinkers I know. And so I think his newsletter produced every day is one of my must reads. I think you'd be quite surprised how many executive boardrooms read Trajectory regularly. So he's a very good audience, and uh, definitely well reading Ben Thompson. Um, Second one, I was going to recommend Des Trainer, and I showed one of his examples in the talk. But he regularly comes up with interesting ways to think about the world. Um, and last one I was going to pick is Shreyas Doshi. Shreyas is a product manager at Stripe. Um, but aside from that, he writes really well, and I think is a really good curator of insight. So he's another one that I would pick.
Absolutely, absolutely. And yeah, I think we concur with you. I think we hosted Shreyas, and that was also one really popular event and some great feedback. So thanks for those names. Um, Shishir, I think this was one very eventful Friday evening for us, and especially with we still have over 100 folks here. It's pretty
Mm.
late in India, so thanks so much.
Yeah.
To close this off, um, we have one interesting question, which we generally learn a lot from. It's one of my personal favorites as well.
Mhm.
It's called "If You Knew Then What You Know Now." So, what would you've had tons of experience working with big firms now building Coda. So, what would you probably tell a younger Shishir?
I should say that the premise of this question is a little tough for me because I'm a no regrets type of person, and so I
Okay.
don't have a lot I look back on and say I wish I had done that differently.
Right.
But that said, I'll answer the question. I think that probably the main thing I would tell people is stay focused on pursuing your best ideas. The world will rearrange around them, and I think that it's sort of related to what we were talking about how to get hired as a product manager. And many people come in and they work through their rubrics and so on. And and the thing that easily gets missed on this is the world actually transacts in ideas. And I think that the people who embrace that quickly and realize it's one of my favorite parts of Silicon Valley. People will ask me a lot about whether they should move here or not, and there's lots of pros and cons to living in Silicon Valley, and I don't think it's necessarily for everyone. But there's one characteristic that I think is very true, and by the way, I often feel this in India as well. Is Silicon Valley is one of those places where you're in a room, you're at a dinner party, and somebody says, "How come this works this way? How come this happens in healthcare? How come nobody made the roads work like this?" Somebody in that room is immediately thinking, how do I make that happen? And that level of, sometimes you call it players not victims, that level of optimism, that level of I can do that, I think that is what makes the world work, and people having the ideas and pursuing them. And then we idolize them and we look at them as if they're unique, and all they are the people that took the first step, and they took their idea and said, I bet I can make this happen in my community, in my business, in my family, and whatever it might be. And so I think that stay focused on pursuing your best ideas. The world will rearrange around them. I think is the main message I would give.
That's amazing. That's amazing. Um, yeah, with that, thank you so much, Shishir. I think we personally loved it. I think Parth and me enjoyed this a lot, and I'm pretty sure all the folks out there. So, guys, do let us know your feedback in case you enjoyed this. Shishir is active on Twitter. I think most active on Twitter. So feel free to tag him and share your feedback. We'd also love to learn from this. So, Shishir, any closing thoughts before we have a couple of exciting announcements for our audience? But any closing thoughts
Oh,
before that?
yeah. Thanks for doing this. It was a great set of questions. I really enjoy doing this, and thanks for everyone who stayed up late for this. I know
Yeah.
the time difference always makes this tough, but I do think it's one of the positives of the pandemic is that for me to give a talk in India would have been a lot of work previously, and now it seems actually quite
Yeah.
reasonable. So I
Yeah.
think silver lining on otherwise terrible thing happening in the world. I think I would love feedback, so please do tag me and send feedback, or feel free to direct message me as well if you prefer. The In terms of the lessons, I would love to hear which of these resonated and which ones people plan to pursue, and I'd love to hear feedback as you do on Coda. If you are interested in working at Coda, please let us know. We are hiring very quickly. But beyond that, please try the product. Let us know what you think. I think it's quite popular in India actually, so
Yeah.
we see a lot of usage there. But I'm always excited to see what people make in Coda.
Yeah.
Send your best examples.
Awesome, awesome, awesome. Thanks once again, Shishir. And for everyone who joined us, thank you so much once again. And since you've stayed up till so late, we have two exciting announcements. One that you might already know. I think last week we launched something called the productsummit.co. So in case you haven't registered already, feel free to check that out. We'll put it out in the chat section. And for this particular session, we'll be sending out a separate email. So you guys will have something exclusive there. Also, only we haven't taken the next event live, but this is something that we're also excited about. He is a popular guy again in Silicon Valley, especially. I think he's the founder of the Silicon Valley product group as well as the author of Inspired. So I think that gives you a hint. And if you guys are interested in that, we'll be sharing the link in the chat section. That's going to be probably going to be another very popular session like this one. So we have a limit on our Zoom, unfortunately, so far. So we're sharing it here before announcing it out there. In case you guys are interested, feel free to check that out. So yeah, with that, I think thanks for once again, Shishir. I think we'll definitely want to host you once again, V2, and hear about Coda's journey. And till then, all the best with that as well. And
Looking
thanks a lot.
forward to it. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks a lot,
Thank you.
Shishir.
Thanks once again, guys.